This is a must-solve CAT 2021 RC because it's a problem and solution format. That's something which is a little bit rarer when it comes to analytical RCs, which is the bulk of CAT RCs. Typically, we will have, maybe a product or a concept, and we look at pros and cons, and the author has a view whether it's good or bad, or we could be comparing two products or two concepts. A problem and solution type of RC is a little bit rarer, but it definitely crops up, enough number of times that it's important to practice. So this that would make this a must-solve RC. Another thing which is there is, this is something where the author tries to identify a root cause, starts with something, and then says that, hey, that is not the root cause, something else is the root cause, right? So, the initial one is given almost as a red herring of sorts. So that's important to help us identify what is the author's view. Now, in case if you're watching this on YouTube, I link a video which is about the author's view for you so that, you can take that up. You can watch that after this one. But as I was saying, definitely a must-solve RC. The majority of the questions here are inferential or direct multiple. So I've pulled up this question. It's an inferential question, but because it's specifically about the Welsh language, we will try to solve this question as we read about the Welsh language. Now, this is something which, of course, the different question types I've covered in the question type lesson. Make sure you watch that before you solve this RC or any of the CAT RCs, because, then you can actually utilize the techniques, right? One last thing before we start off with the passage itself. Slot 2 was the toughest slot that we had in CAT 2021, but this RC is something which is doable. There's another RC that's easy, and one I would say which is somewhere between medium and hard, and then one RC which is really hard. But then when in a tough slot, typically the VA questions are a little bit easier than the other slots, which is why I recommend that, for many of you, especially if you're not able to find the difficulty level or you're not able to choose the right RC, starting with the VA questions would help. There are multiple other benefits. I link another video if you're watching this on YouTube where, I've spoken about what are the different ways in which you could start the VARC slot, and that will help you figure out what works best for you. Of course, practice it in mocks and sectionals and all of that. If you have our packs, even if it's a mock pack, of course you have the test taking strategy sessions, which you can also come and understand more. But back to what I was saying about the slot. In a tougher slot, you will still have maybe the VA questions are easier, or there will be enough easy RCs. So in this case, for instance, if you went for the VA questions and you did a couple of RCs, that along with normalization would boost you to a pretty good percentile. And if you're able to do 3 RCs and enough of the VA questions, you can definitely get to the 99 percentile. If you're not sure what is this normalization and scaling up, just ask me, in the upcoming class, me or Vignesh, or if you're watching it on YouTube, just put a comment in the chat and we will we'll put up a video for you. So now let's start off with the passage finally. It's easy to forget that most of the world's languages are still transmitted orally with no widely established written form. So most of the world's languages are, people are speaking, right? It's being transmitted orally and they don't even have a well-established written form. While speech communities are increasingly involved in projects to protect their languages, orality is fragile and contributes to linguistic vulnerability. This definitely makes sense. If there isn't much written record or no written record, then, it's easier for the language, to maybe, be corrupted or even be completely lost, right? Because it's just people speaking. So what happens if, those people, they stop speaking, or, maybe they move away, or like they pass away. But indigenous languages are about much more than unusual words and intriguing grammar. They function as vehicles for the transmission of cultural traditions, environmental understandings, and knowledge about medicinal plants, all at risk when elders die and livelihoods are disrupted. So we can see that the author is speaking about these indigenous languages in a very positive way. There are multiple benefits, cultural tradition, things about the environment or about medicinal plants. They contain knowledge of all of these, so it's important. At the same time, because majority of them are oral, they are very vulnerable, right? Like we could lose these languages. Both push and pull factors lead to the decline of languages. So the first sentence here gives us an idea that this paragraph is going to tell us what are the causes for languages declining. There seem to be 2 types, push and pull factors. Through war, famine, and natural disasters, whole communities can be destroyed, taking their language with them to the grave. We have an example also given. More commonly, speakers live on but abandon their language in favor of another vernacular, a widespread process that linguists refer to as language shift, from which few languages are immune. Now, I would have probably already told you in class multiple times, whenever you have few or little without the word it means almost none. So very few languages, so hardly any languages are immune from this language shift, where the speakers are preferring another language because of some other reason. Such trading up and out of a speech form occurs for complex political, cultural, and economic reasons, sometimes voluntary for economic and educational reasons, though often amplified by state coercion and neglect. Welsh, long stigmatized and disparaged by the British state, has rebounded with vigor. Okay, so before we look at this Welsh example and the question, let's understand what the author is trying to say. We already knew that languages that are oral are more vulnerable, but now we are getting in deep and we are understanding more about languages declining. So languages declining, this happens because of two types of factors, push and pull. Now we don't specifically have explicitly given what is push and pull, but I'm going to assume that the first thing is push, where an entire community dies because of some major tragedy and that language is gone, right? So this should be push and then this should be pull. Logically also it makes sense, right? So this is like where maybe the speakers are being pulled towards another language. Does it matter if I'm wrong? I don't think so. If we get to know that it's the other way around, I'll just change it off. So this is when we don't have any speakers left. And pull is when speakers shift to other languages. Now this shift can be because of multiple reasons, political, cultural, and economic. So I'll probably start with the economic because it is voluntary. I'm just using dollar, can use rupee also. Money or education is the voluntary part, but it can also happen because of political and cultural reasons. So this is something which is easy to understand. So for example, in India, you and I, we are discussing English, right, which is a foreign language. The reason that we are doing it is because, when we think in terms of education or we think in terms of working, it's much easier to interact in English, and so it can be an advantage many times if you're doing anything which requires, interacting with people outside of India. So I've worked in MNCs, for example, right, multinational companies, which were actually, headquartered in other places. So, the language of choice is English, and that's something which is very common, right? There can also be, obviously political languages. We can also look at Indian languages from that perspective, but other things which come to mind is China. They had multiple languages, but then their government said that Mandarin is going to be mandatory. That's the language which is going to be used. So everybody essentially had to learn and speak Mandarin, even if their language was something else. There's also something which happened closer home in Sri Lanka, where they pretty much out of the blue said, okay, that's it, we're only going to speak Sinhalese. In fact, Tamil was one of the languages there, and that was sort of like, in terms of official languages, that was completely removed. So these are things which definitely can happen. Culturally, I can think of an example closer home. Again, in India, we have so many languages, right? So I'm from Orissa, for example. So my mother tongue is Oriya. I also speak Hindi. But one reason why I speak English, aside from, the economic or the educational bit, could also be to communicate. So if I'm communicating with anybody who doesn't understand Oriya or Hindi, then the language which both of us will probably understand is English. So Vignesh and I, for example, we communicate in English. It's a personal example, but because he's Tamil, he speaks Tamil and English, and I speak Hindi, Oriya, and English. So English is the common language. So this could be one of the cultural things. There could of course be a lot more, but this is something which I do, right? When I'm reading an RC or even reading any passage, right, any article, I will try to visualize. I will try to make sense of what the author is saying. And these examples, it is taking time when I'm saying it, but then when you are visualizing it, thinking of your own situation, it is actually a lot quicker. It literally happens in a fraction of a second, right? Because it's more like I just have that image of me talking in English with somebody, right? So things like that, or me working, right? So the monetary aspect will come. So that's something which is a lot quicker, and that is something which I would definitely encourage you to do, so that you understand the passage and you understand the author's view. But at the same time, you have to also be careful that you're not bringing in your own knowledge or your own biases. So if I could probably think of other times where I've chosen to speak something which is not my mother tongue, maybe Hindi or definitely English, right? But I'm sticking to the reasons which are given in the passage. So that I would say is definitely important, especially if we are reading an RC or we are reading an article which is about a topic that we know a lot about. We have to be clear to know what information comes from the passage and what we know, because we don't want to sort of corrupt our understanding of this passage with our knowledge and potentially maybe get to a wrong answer. I've seen that happen with many students. We've, if you're a student, you might have already had those discussions with mocks, right? So this is something which should definitely be important. So now coming back to the passage itself, languages could decline because of multiple things, push and pull factors. Push is push is when there aren't any speakers left, and pull is when the speakers are preferring another language. This could be out of choice because it is economically better, or you're choosing. I mean, education is there more in that language or something. It could also be because of state coercion, so the state forcing you, or neglect, which is political, or for cultural reasons. Now, Welsh seems to be the political example, right? If you see, it's in two parts. One is the state coercion or neglect part. It was something which the British government actually stigmatized and disparaged. So they disparaged, or they, criticized the language, and anybody speaking Welsh, it was taken like a stigma. It was like a negative thing. So this was done for long, but now it has rebounded with vigor, right? So for a long time, the state coerced people to, probably speak English, given that, it's a British government. But then now it has actually rebounded. People have gone back to speaking Welsh. So that is what we will look for in this question. The author mentions the Welsh language to show. The primary thing that I will focus is, this part, because it's an example for this. If I have an option which has both the initial part where people probably didn't speak English and the rebounding, that's great. If I don't have that, if I have maybe one option which has this part and one option which is the second part, I will prefer the first one because it's an example for this. The author mentions the Welsh language to show that efforts to integrate Welsh speakers in the English-speaking fold have been fruitless. This is factually correct. If we make it, have we fruitless now, or are now fruitless, because now it has rebounded, but for long it was something which was disparaged and people were even like stigmatized, right? It was like a stigma. So probably at that time people did somewhere speak English more than Welsh. So I would not go for this. Let's see if there's something better. Languages can revive even after their speakers have gone through a language shift. So language shift was actually given in this context, right? So language shift from which few languages are immune. So this is, the first part, and this also has the second part. I'm not too happy with just language shift. Usually we do have options which explain what it is. So let's see if there is something better, right? Otherwise, I would say that, 2 is definitely preferable to option 1 because, 1 is speaking only about the second part. 2 at least has the first part also. While often pilloried, globalization can in fact support linguistic revival. Now the next paragraph is clearly not about Welsh, it is going in a different direction. So there's nothing about globalization that we have as of now. This was in fact an example for state coercion or neglect. And I mean, Welsh, it's in Wales, which is part of, the Great Britain or UK, I guess. So globalization doesn't seem to be in context here. Of course, you've obviously solved the RC, so you know that globalization comes later on, but in this case, it is not relevant. So option 3, we can immediately eliminate. Vulnerable languages can rebound with state effort. This seems so correct, except for this last part, right? So remember my 80-20 elimination. It's not the state which is getting it to rebound. In fact, the state was the one that was trying to ensure that people are not speaking the language, right, for long. So this second part is completely wrong. Vulnerable languages can rebound. If it was something like can rebound despite state coercion, it would have been perfect, right? But this is factually wrong. So we eliminate it and we go for option 2, which, as I was explaining, is better than option 1. I would say it's just a tad better than option 1 because, it has this first part. I would have definitely preferred an option which explains what language shift is rather than just mentioning it. But because we don't have that, we will go for this, which is correct. It is definitely factual. It is correct. It is just that usually the examiners prefer something where the explanation is given. So which is why I was looking for something. Many speakers of endangered, poorly documented languages have embraced new digital media with excitement. Speakers of previously exclusively oral tongues are turning to the web as a virtual space for the language to live on. Internet technology offers powerful ways for oral traditions and cultural practices to survive, even thrive, among increasingly mobile communities. I watched videos of traditional wedding ceremonies and songs are recorded on smartphones in London by Nepali migrants, then uploaded on YouTube and watched an hour later by relatives in remote Himalayan villages. So what is happening? Because of the internet, because of, new digital media, new platforms, again, things like YouTube, which is given as an example. So what is happening? These oral languages can now survive, right? So the oral languages, their traditions, their cultural practices can survive. So earlier, if somebody was moving, so we'll take this, example of Nepal itself. If somebody from Nepal would move to London, probably there would be very few people who speak their language, right? They could connect with, and the connect with, the folks back home would be very, very limited, right? But now with the internet, now with things like YouTube, what can happen? They can stay connected, and there are now records, right? So if they're speaking they're all obviously connected. The internet is connecting. If there's something like some cultural tradition, something happening like a wedding, right, that can be uploaded on YouTube and like everybody can watch it. So you can have a Nepali wedding in Nepal which a Nepali person in London is watching it, or what this example is saying, which is the opposite, where the wedding is happening in London and people back home in Nepal are also able to watch it. And that protects the traditions, that protects the language, because now there is not just a record, but I think people are also connecting, right? So you can be anywhere, right? These increasingly mobile communities, right? So somebody can be in one place, someone can be in another continent, but now they are able to connect. So that is something which is helping the language to survive. So this was the problem part. Now, definitely, I'll just put it as net plus social media. These are the solutions, especially for oral languages. Globalization is regularly and often uncritically pilloried as a major threat to linguistic diversity. What is pillory? Now, a pillory was something which was, used almost like a punishment device. So, globalization is what is being criticized as a major threat to linguistic diversity. Just see how it is written. Globalization is regularly pilloried. So, this is something which people regularly do. The author may or may not do it. Right? Just as this is something which someone else is doing, this is something which someone else is saying. So it's important to notice these things. But in fact, globalization is as much process as it is ideology, certainly when it comes to language. Okay, this is a little complicated. What is this process and ideology? Let's understand more. The real forces behind cultural homogenization are unbending beliefs exchanged through a globalized delivery system reinforced by the historic monolingualism prevalent in much of the West. So globalization is not the problem. It is helping. It is the medium. It is like the delivery system. But these languages dying out, or homogenization. What is homogenization? Something is homogeneous means it's all the same. Heterogeneous means there is variety, there is difference. So in the case of languages, homogeneous means only certain languages are spoken, like English, for example, right, is spoken. And that is what is leading to some of these vulnerable languages dying out. That is not because of globalization. Globalization is just the medium. The reason are unbending beliefs which are reinforced by this historic monolingualism which is prevalent in much of the West. So Western countries, if you say they either speak only English or only French or German or whatever it is, right? They all have just one language. All of these countries have one language. So that is the part which, according to the author, is leading to these, the languages dying out, right? Monolingualism is regularly accompanied by a deep-seated conviction in the value of that language above all others. Now, what is monolingualism is also explained, something which we can understand. Along with monolingualism, if anybody speaks just one language, if anybody speaks just English, for example, right, that's never going to be anyone in India. So say somebody in the US or somebody in Britain, if they speak only English, they also have this deep-seated conviction. They have this strong, belief within themselves that that language is more valuable, or that language is above all others. So anybody who's, from an English-speaking country will think that English is the most important language. It is more important than, other languages from Asia or, any other part of the world, right? The same would happen for other, like, say, like the examples which I gave probably, right? Like French or German and all. Across the largest economies that make up the G8, being monolingual is often the norm, with multilingualism appearing unusual and even somewhat exotic. So this is also something which is normal. So the G8, you will have like, UK, US, France, and, Germany and all of them. So majority of those countries are monolingual. The monolingual mindset stands in sharp contrast to the lived reality in most of the world. So the reality in most of the world is, majority of the world is multilingual. So again, if you think of Asia itself, people are multilingual. In India, people will speak not just their own language and English, but also probably some other language. Like I, for example, speak Oriya and Hindi, and of course English. Monolingualism, then, not globalization, should be a primary concern. So this line is so important because it tells us that monolingualism is the root cause. That is the one which we have to be concerned about. So the problem is coming from monolingualism, right? Monolingualism is causing this. Why is monolingualism causing this? Because anybody that's monolingual thinks that their language is the best. Their language is above all others. So we need to basically, somewhere fix this. Multilingualism can help us live in a more connected and more interdependent world. By widening access to technology, globalization can support indigenous and scholarly communities engaged in documenting and protecting our shared linguistic heritage. So globalization can actually be part of the solution. Can essentially help in this. I mean, obviously, it's not helping in internet and social media, but it's helping people who are documenting those languages, probably using internet and social media primarily. For the last 5,000 years, the rise and fall of languages was intimately tied to the plough, sword, and book. In our digital age, the keyboard, screen, and web will play a decisive role in shaping the future linguistic diversity of our species. So, one thing in the beginning, multilingualism is something which is good, aside from all the things we had in the beginning about cultural traditions, medicinal plants, and all of that. It'll actually lead to a more connected and more interdependent world if more people can speak each other's language. So, if somebody in the US or UK can speak an Indian language, or vice versa, just as we speak English, if they would speak an Indian language, it would lead to a more connected and more interdependent world. So that's obviously a good thing. Now, how would that happen? The technology is already there. Globalization also can support those who are trying to document and save these languages. An important part over here is to understand this plough, sword, and book. So plough, we usually spell it as PLOUGH. It is basically a farming implement, right? So farming, sword, again, fighting, and the book. All of these have led to economic benefit or economic development. Once we had farming, we had more food. Anybody that was able to attack, let's say, you had the ruler of one territory, they were attacking another territory. If they won, what would happen? They would gain more wealth, right? Because they would take over that particular territory as well. And book, of course, as we have had more and more books, more and more education, definitely economy has gotten much ahead. So rise and fall of languages have happened with this. So if I'll go with the sword example, for instance, right? So if one territory is winning over another territory, maybe even their language is being imposed over the defeated territory, right? So these are things. And today, how is it linked? The keyboard, the screen, and web, right? So this is what is shaping the linguistic diversity. So earlier, farming, fights, or wars rather, and books, these are the things which shaped which languages we speak. And now it is going to be the internet and technology which is shaping that. So our problem is the decline of a lot of indigenous languages. The root cause for that is monolingualism and not globalization. The solution is going to be people becoming more multilingual. So people who are monolingual becoming more multilingual. That itself will lead to a more interconnected world. And the major medium is going to be the internet and social media, which essentially helps us in documenting those traditions, making sure that those languages are still spoken. There's some record, especially because a lot of them are oral, right? So that would be the problem and the solution in this passage. And now let's look at the questions. From the passage, we can infer that the author is in favor of, okay, so we know that the author is in favor of, not monolingualism, but multilingualism, using technology to sort of protect these languages. Definitely the author is in favor of all of these indigenous languages. So let's look for something on these lines. Greater multilingualism is definitely something that the author is in favor of. So this actually can, right away, you can go for this. If you're in a rush, you could actually do that because this is something the author is definitely in favor of. However, we will of course look at the other options, and that is what I would recommend in majority of the cases. Language shifts across languages. Now, language shifts, if you remember, it's actually something negative, right? Language shift is where people are abandoning their languages, their own language, for something else. So this is not something the author is in favor of. An expanded state role in the preservation of languages. This is actually not given anywhere. That government or any government does not need to play a role necessarily. We've spoken more about the technology aspect, and even from a globalization aspect, we're speaking more from an economic perspective because it lead to an interconnected, interdependent world. So I would say definitely this is preferable to option 3. Cultural homogenization, definitely not, right? When we want more languages, we don't want it to be homogeneous or the same. Monolingualism would be homogeneous. If you don't know the meaning of this word, you could still get it. Because if you see that, cultural homogenization is given as the problem, the real forces behind homogenization it's something which is reinforced by monolingualism. So you can sort of connect these two and understand that this is probably something the author is not in favor of. So option 1 becomes the correct answer here. The author lists all of the following as reasons for the decline or disappearance of a language except. Now, since I've taken notes, we will refer to these notes. Along with this, there's one more thing, which is, if the language is oral. In case if you haven't taken notes, it's fine because, primarily these 2 paragraphs is where we have the reasons for a language declining. So we'll find that 3 of these 4 options are given as reasons. We eliminate that. Whatever's left becomes the right answer. Make sure you don't miss this and make a silly mistake. The focus on only a few languages as a result of widespread internet use. Okay, this is definitely not there. Focus on a few languages is fine, that is monolingualism, but it is not because of widespread internet use. In fact, the internet is given as a solution. We have that whole example of, Nepali immigrants in London where, there's this wedding and then, folks back home are able to watch it and so on. So this should be the right answer. Governments promoting certain languages over others is given political, and we did discuss that Welsh example as well, which is there. So we can eliminate this option. A catastrophic event that entirely eliminates a people and their culture. That is the push part, right? So again, we have this whole communities can be destroyed, and that's something. Now, in this case, the example, of course, it is more, humans who've done it, colonists. But, we have war, famine, and natural disasters. So that is again something which is given. Of course, if, somebody comes and attacks and essentially commits genocide, that also is a catastrophic event. People shifting away from their own language to study or work in another language. That is the, the pull part, the voluntary part, right? Sometimes it's voluntary for economic and educational reasons. So this is also something which is given. Easy for us to confidently go for the first option. We can infer all of the following about indigenous languages from the passage except that. So again, 3 out of these 4 would either be given about indigenous languages, or we can infer it based on what's given about indigenous languages. Whatever is left becomes the right answer. Make sure that you understand that indigenous languages are these languages, which are not those languages which are spoken primarily by the G8 countries. So, things like English and French and German and all of those will not be indigenous languages. Indigenous languages are those which are spoken by, smaller tribes, some of the older languages, maybe the oral languages. So that is the only one thing we need to know from a vocabulary perspective. I do think indigenous is given somewhere, so that again would make it easier. Their vocabulary and grammatical constructs have been challenging to document. This is not something which is given. We have been told that they have unusual words and intriguing grammar, and somewhere else I think it's been described as exotic, especially from a monolingual perspective. But nowhere have we been told that it's challenging to document. In fact, we know that a lot of people now are trying to document it. Right? There's digital media, and then towards the end, we've been told that there are these communities that are engaged in documenting and protecting, right? So this would be the right answer, definitely. Just looking at the other options, people are increasingly working on documenting these languages. That is something which is given, right? I was just showing it. And it's also something which can be inferred from this bit. So we'll eliminate this option. They are repositories of traditional knowledge about the environment and culture. That is something coming from this part, right? So they function as the vehicle for transmission of cultural traditions, environmental understanding, and medicinal plants. What is a repository? It's like a storehouse. So that's again only one word from a vocabulary perspective that you need to know. If you have realized that this is the right answer, even if you're not sure of this word repositories, if you realize that the first option is right, you could still eliminate this one. I've explained why in multiple videos. I'm not going in again. They're in danger of being wiped out as most can only be transmitted orally. That is also something which is given. Most of the world's languages are still transmitted orally, and that is something which makes them vulnerable. So we can eliminate this, and this becomes the right answer. So that's it for this RC, and tomorrow I'm going to solve another slot 2 RC. Stay tuned for that. I think that's again a very good practice RC because if you understand the author's view, then answering all of the 4 questions becomes really easy. So it is the passage which sort of takes precedence. It's a socio-cultural RC with a little bit of an undercurrent of politics, but not so much. But what will surprise you there is the author's view is something which will go completely against your own view. So again, that bit very important for practice. So stay tuned. And if you're watching this later anytime, then of course you'll have the RC right next. So whether it's in the lesson or on YouTube, you can just try to solve that and watch the video.